Hey, Nick, Greg.
Hey, man.
We're going to be starting in just about 3 more minutes. Just going to give a few minutes for everyone to kind of join. Looks like we already got our first question asking if we can send raw meat by mail. I think may have missed the mark a little bit on that one. You might be the wrong panelist here. So unfortunately, that is not true. All right, cool. I think we can get going here. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Mike Yeager, I head engineering here at MetaRouter. And today we're kicking off a series of chats in partnership with McGraw, formerly FN Amazing, to kind of discuss current challenges facing the EdTech and MarTech industries. So today I'm joined here with Nick Friedman Tabackhurst. He's Director of MarTech Solutions at McGraw. Hi, Nick. Just want to give you a second to kind of introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Happy to be here with you guys. Yeah, like Mike said, I work with McGraw. We just changed our name from FN Amazing. And basically, we're an agency specializing in marketing technology. We help companies pick the right tools, integrate them, and then help optimize funnels, use their customer data, personalize, automate, analytics, all that kind of stuff to bring up revenue.
Awesome, thanks. And then we also have Greg Brunk. He's the head of product here at MetaRouter. Hey, Greg.
How you doing? Yeah, it's good to be here. It's a crazy time with everything going on, and everybody's trying to figure out what's essential and what's not. And it's a good time to be thinking about what's happening in modern marketing and ad ops stacks. And it's just it's cool to be here talking about this stuff. So
awesome. Well, great. I mean, our intent to this is to kind of keep things very conversational. We're going to be recording, and if anyone had any questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. We'll try to get to those to try to fill in as many dots as we can if we're going somewhere where people aren't quite familiar or have any questions about kind of anything that we're talking about. So setting the table for this, you know, we're talking about the death of third-party cookies, and I think kind of the conversation starts back in September 2017 when Apple released ITP, which is the Intelligent Tracking Prevention System. It was a system that was built to kind of limit third parties from placing tracking cookies on various websites. These tracking cookies could essentially be used by these third parties to kind of see a user's behavior as they kind of journeyed across the internet, and there was obviously a lot of privacy concerns there, and so Apple kind of came up with this idea that you know, those should be blocked, and so they started actively working against that. Started out with ITP 1.0, has kind of iterated and changed and morphed over time to kind of its latest iteration. And then while at the same time, kind of fast forwarding a little bit further, other browsers started to kind of really catch in on this. Firefox is kind of the notable other one. Brave, which was kind of a privacy-centric browser, kind of came onto the scene late last year. Kind of all culminating to sort of a major announcement at the beginning of this year, which was Google and the Chrome browser, and essentially kind of came out with their intention to phase out third-party cookies kind of in the next two years. So a lot happening. A lot of the MarTech and AdTech stack kind of is powered by this stuff. So, you know, I think I'd kind of like to start the conversation with kind of like, why is this important? You know, like, how are these technologies kind of being used right now? And you know, how are marketers going to be kind of affected there? So maybe Nick, I'll kind of turn it over to you for kind of first shot at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing here, cookies have been around for a very long time and are sort of the fundamental way that a user's identity is preserved. You know, otherwise there's no way to tell you're same person visiting one page as another. And they got taken up because it was the only way to do that for all kinds of purposes. And as you said, I mean, Apple and Mozilla and now Microsoft's in on the game with the new Edge browser have kind of declared unilateral war against cookies and tracking of all sorts, which is pretty interesting. Whereas in Europe, it's been GDPR and this legislative stuff. This is all grassroots here in the United States with these companies just going out. And while they're focus is on third-party tracking and privacy, which definitely affects interest-based advertising and attribution and things like that. There's just been a ton of collateral damage with this as well. You know, it's affecting web analytics, it's affecting your social share widget, single sign-on. I mean, everywhere where you're trying to track somebody and it isn't all first party, even if it's just Google Analytics, this is impacting it. And I think it's also, I'd be interested what you think about it too, Greg, but I feel like more people using ad blockers has also come out of this. And then that's even more severe. You know, one of my clients, they can't get forms to submit on their site if someone has an ad blocker because they're using Marketo. And it's just that kind of stuff, you know, completely undermines your business.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, Apple has the luxury of doing what they're doing because they have a direct one-to-one consumer products relationship, and they're not really concerned with the sort of ad operations in the industry and the various mechanics that are necessary because they're already, by the time you're using the iPhone and browsing, you've already paid them what they're going to get paid in that equation. So, you know, the interesting thing is going to be what the industry does to figure out how to keep the internet free in spite of both the private and public sector regulations. When you have GDPR and you have browsers blocking things. And, you know, what I find really interesting is watching sort of the ad operations industry try to respond. And they, you know, they're pursuing, some of them are pursuing, you know, hashed PII as like the great solution for the cookie problem. Others are pursuing sort of global identity solutions that get some momentum, but then they get shot down by Mozilla and Apple, and it's difficult. And then, you know, somebody mentioned this in the Q&A, but fingerprinting is increasingly becoming sort of an option. And I think what we'll find is a globally applicable solution sometime in the next several years that solves the problem of exposing customer data through cookies on the browser and people being uniquely and specifically identified by third parties on the internet. Somebody is going to globally solve that problem. The bigger question is, what do you do in the meantime while all these different sort of solutions vie for power, and different, like, ad operations industry has its specific thing it wants to do and consumers have things they want to do. So while everybody's battling that out, what do you do in the meantime to make sure you don't lose efficacy with your advertising campaigns and the partners you're integrating with? And I think, you know, MetaRouter's stance generally on it is to take as much control as you possibly can of these dynamics. If you own the data stream, then you can, on a partner by partner basis, choose to try to fingerprint in order to identify with this user, manage hash PII for this user, or for this particular platform that you're integrating with, or, you know, choose to go anonymous with these analytics platforms and just accept that you're going to have limited efficacy with that platform because identity tracking is complicated. So when you kind of move the tracking and integration ecosystem out of a bunch of tags running on the page, managing and using cookies and communicating outside of your control, into more of a controlled data pipeline, data architecture, internalized in-house, and you start to be able to kind of look at different partners on a case-by-case basis and your different goals on a case-by-case basis and custom tailor solutions, because everybody's going to be pushing different solutions to the limitations, solutions to the ad blocker problem, solutions to, you know, government regulations, and how are they going to adapt. And you don't want to be left at the whim of how, you know, Google or your DSP or Adobe decides to update their tag on their own time to play by the rules, and to maintain efficacy. You kind of want to try to get out ahead of that, and that's generally how we. I know there's a lot of nuance in that answer, but that's generally how we approach it.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. You know, the thing that comes to mind, kind of off of both your guys' points, is sort of, you know, the reason I think we kind of saw this initial explosion into the ad tech world was really about kind of the democratization of this identity piece. And certainly, you know, you've heard about the walled gardens and Apple and Amazon and sort of these powerhouses that are kind of becoming the key players in this space. And you know, there's been a whole sort of movement, you know, to really kind of tear down those walled gardens and kind of open up access. And at the same time, this move kind of seems like it's definitely starting to hurt those players. I think kind of with more of the open space, you know, like Greg, you're saying, sort of moving to that server-side fingerprinting. It's like you're kind of opening that up. You're offering kind of a lot of nefarious players, but I think that collateral damage, Nick, you kind of talked about, also kind of goes to that democracy side of things. They're kind of getting lumped in with sort of these smaller tech players who don't have the the user imprints that like a Facebook or Google have, and so it'll be kind of quite interesting to kind of see how some of those smaller players are kind of able to navigate these waters, because they're the ones who are third party in a lot of ways, like a Facebook and a Google. They're not really going to be affected as much because they're not really sitting in the third party. They're more of a second party where they've already identified the user and have seen the user before.
Well, it's really interesting because what's unfortunately happening is that with these increased regulations, it's playing into the hands of those walled gardens, because what Facebook has to do to maintain their efficiency is they just have to figure out what Facebook profile the user is. So they have one unique challenge in order to be able to attribute the behavior data that's being tracked to a Facebook user. But MediaMath and Trade Desk and AppNexus, they have to figure out who you are everywhere, and they have to figure out who you are for the SSPs that they're serving up creative to or from, and they have to figure out how to do this broad landscape of communication. So what they're gonna push for is things like global anonymous ID solutions that are making headway, like Big ID and Digitrust, and they're going to try to figure out how to get everybody to speak a common language so that the cookie becomes less important and just that anonymous attribution becomes really important. But for Facebook, they don't want to see that happen, because as that sort of world starts to lose its efficacy, more and more people are just going to switch to these easier first-party singular advertising sources where Facebook gets to collect all the money from the ad spend, and all they have to figure out is one unique problem, which is, what Facebook profile user are you? And then they have all the information available to them to be able to both charge for the ads and track the conversions and get the credit. And so if some of these sort of more open source, anonymous style, global identity or fingerprinting style solutions don't take off, it's interesting. It's really going to play into the second party advertiser, Facebook, Amazon, even Google to some extent sort of solutions, and it's really going to play well into their hands. So
the thing that's interesting with what you're saying there, Greg, which I really agree with, is when we talk about bringing your data in-house, which is really important. I mean, I think we're going to be seeing the renaissance here of the email list and collecting social followers, because you can't make your loyalty program and your nurturing program put a remarketing pixel on your site and go home. That just doesn't work anymore, or you won't get enough coverage. You've effectively got a 7-day look back window now, so you can retarget people for a week, and then all bets are off after that. And for smaller companies, in the SMB space, it's impractical for them to have their own in-house Google Analytics. They can't afford it. They don't have the expertise to support it. And so it's really going to be needing help to find the solutions that are keeping up with the new web standards, that are keeping up with the new privacy standards. So you aren't, Adobe's famously slow for keeping Adobe Analytics on the cutting edge of this stuff. And Google's not that fast either. They're big trains to turn. And if you look at the Amplitude, Mixpanel, Segment, the people in that area, you're seeing a lot more agility in people working with that more aggressively. But one question I had for you, Greg, just from what you're saying is, yes, I can go to Facebook and, upload the phone numbers of all my leads and get attribution that way, which is super powerful. But are you seeing anything with the mid-size and smaller publishers getting more traffic just because they have a niche audience? If I want to reach people who care about dogs, I can advertise on, Canine Radio Podcast or something like that, instead of going out to the network with interest targeting.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you want to take a crack at that one? I feel like you're really well equipped for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you think about sort of the niche advertising and sort of this democratization. To me, the first thing was always about saving money, right? I think this kind of goes to, when people first wanted to run their sports, digital, they would go to ESPN, and then they said, man, if I could follow the same user around, like, this is my target audience, how can I find more kind of effective ways to use my dollars in this world? And so a lot of this kind of technology that sprang up around that stuff was really around sort of, well, at the end of the day, it's not about going and spending all your money on the major players. It's about finding your audience, right? And so, you know, that's sort of the kind of cutting of the legs that I think, so to speak, that kind of these smaller players are starting to see now is a lot of this, you know, retargeting and conversion attribution, which was, you know, really kind of quite sophisticated and really kind of helping them kind of get a leg up on some of these bigger players, is now starting to kind of be stripped away. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, it'll all be driven by performance, right? And I think what the small players kind of offered was sort of, hey, we'll kind of go after these smaller audiences, kind of save you the dollar and make sure we're targeting, you know, with the best quality that we can. And I think that's kind of yet to be seen. You know, I think certainly once we kind of progress a little bit more down this path, as some of these, you know, retargeting and sort of, you know, multi-touch attribution points are kind of slowly kind of whittled away. Like, are those solutions going to be quick to kind of come up with new creative solutions, or is that sort of going to just kind of hamstring that side of the industry a bit, you know?
Yeah, and you're gonna start to see essentially one of two things happen. You're gonna start where there, like Mike was saying, where there used to be a lot of very individual relationships. You will either start to see a return to that form. So we had a lot of major players that created aggregation and bid exchanges and really started to take the complexity out of following users around the internet and advertising them in different spaces, and took the complexity out of small businesses who ran sites to be able to run ads and not have to figure out how to manage an ad ecosystem, just integrate. You'll either see, because of the basic hamstringing of those different partners' ability to talk via cookies and via the browser, you'll start to see more individual relationships pop back up. So boutique vendors will be able to start to succeed again because they only need a one-on-one relationship with you as the site. Or you'll start to see a lot of backdoor trading, which is what we're seeing now. We're starting to see huge growth in identity industries and fingerprinting industries and people like Neustar and LiveRamp, who are essentially trading staggering amounts of information about users all behind the scenes. And it's all happening outside, like you said, uploading a ton of phone numbers in order to create an audience. Instead of generating that organically from behavior and traffic, you're sort of sharing people's PII outside of the context of the places where those users have any control, which is the browser and the internet and the device. And so, and I think that there's probably some good in that. There's efficiencies that are gained, but there's also opens up another sort of question of, if we're regulating the browsers, are people just going to go behind the scenes and deal in this information regardless, which I think we are seeing to some degree, because that's the way to compete with Facebook, who doesn't need any of this information. They just have to figure out the Facebook profile user, and they have a lot of ways to do that. They have match tables they can create, and there's only really one complicated dynamic that they have to solve for. And so I think, you know, going back to what we said earlier, like what we really like to see is individual companies taking more control of the dynamic, the routing and the communication and the enrichment of the data, and the utilization of the data, and custom tailoring what they want to accomplish specifically to their needs. And what that looks like is obviously finding really good relationships with audience management tools. That looks like finding a good way to set up first-party mechanisms, so you're not getting blocked either by compliance or by ad blockers or by browser restrictions. You're negotiating with the data in a first-party context that's safe and controlled and secure and under your control, and routing that into server-side mechanics and first-party mechanics where you're controlling the full life cycle of the data, and then making a decision, both what we think ethically is in compliance with restrictions and regulations and is in compliance with users' preferences, but also you now have the route, you have the orchestration, you have the pipeline, you can choose to do the delivery mechanics from within your control, essentially, rather than sort of waiting to see what happens on the browser and suddenly realizing like, oh, my audiences are losing 50% efficacy since Mozilla rolled out its change. You're sitting there saying, nothing's changed about my dynamic. I took the data off of my page into my own control, and then I'm choosing where to distribute and how to enrich and how to fingerprint and how to attribute that data inside of my control. And so as additional restrictions come out against third-party cookies and even local storage is going to start to become more regulated, and everything about the browser is going to become more regulated, just take the third-party reliance off the table for yourself, and at least put yourself in the best position to say, oh, cool, Digitrust is taking off. 26 of the integrations that I use are now supporting Digitrust. Great. All I have to do is figure out the Digitrust ID, and now I can reintegrate with all 26 of these partners, and I don't have to wait for all their JavaScript libraries to update and get on board and figure out how to adjust to compliance. And so that's, I think that's the way to survive this transitionary period until we end up with something like they have in mobile, which is the ID for advertisers. Everybody supports it, straightforward, simple, don't have to worry about cookies and complication. Everybody's speaking the same language. And I really do believe we'll get to something like that one way or another in the internet, even if the government has to force it through. And in the meantime, I think the best adaptation you can have is taking as much possible control over the data pipelines as you can.
Yeah, that kind of leads to my next session. One other kind of interesting thing I'm seeing on a trend wise, specifically talking about this, is sort of the rise of the email. You know, if we're looking at the programmatic stack, you know, really benefits the publishers who are kind of selling this advertising space to be able to identify. The better they can identify, the more they can kind of maximize revenue on their side. And so, you know, you're talking about kind of the death of the cookies, and I kind of see this as sort of like the rise of the email. I think this kind of fits into the point you guys were both kind of bringing up, which is, you know, it's still, you know, first party internal CRMs, like it's still going to be very important. And as, you know, I'm already starting to see it, all these, you know, Wired and, you know, Medium and all these places sign up with an email if you want to view our free content. And that's the natural progression, right? Like, I think people are starting to see that as like, how are we going to solve this problem? And we're seeing it a lot on the ad tech side. If you're not using cookie identification, you know, hashed email, those kind of pieces kind of being replacement. It'll kind of be interesting as kind of regulation grows and stuff like that, to see how, you know, how that world can live. Because, you know, hashed email, obviously anonymous by nature, but still we're moving away from cookies to something that's more tied to an identity than you know, random cookie value in a way. So maybe with, you know, the last, you know, 10 minutes here, I was curious to kind of get some perspective. I think Nick and Greg on sort of like, how are you guys approaching this? You know, what's Medallisk's approach on sort of like, how are you advising clients on sort of this kind of changing landscape, and how to kind of start moving towards, you know, being prepared for this, I think?
Yeah, on our side, I mean, really, we've got a window here where we aren't totally messed up, where things keep closing down, but there are some workarounds. A lot of the technologies are still working. And I don't know what if Google's proposal is going to get accepted. If it does, it's going to look like Windows Vista with a whole bunch of accept this, accept that, you know, whatever. But, you know, what we're really telling people is start collecting better data. To what you were saying, you know, we're tracking everything. We're tracking user profiles, and we aren't relying on Google Analytics for anything. It's there, it's a great tool, but you got to start warehousing stuff. You have to have immediate access to the events, the data, because if nothing else, even if you've got ad blockers, you aren't collecting the most data. Machine learning's working pretty well in Europe to help people extrapolate for all the people who don't click the cookie consent button, because the rate on that can be really low for some sites. And then the other thing is, to what everyone's been saying, collect that email address. You know, you have to have the exit intent pop up saying, give me your email address. You have to have valuable lead generation magnets and things like that, because if you don't, you don't really have anything. And if you do have that, and you can get people to keep coming back every 7 days, your 7-day look back window stops being a problem. And that's probably revenue as well. So if your website is just a brochure, if it isn't making you money and driving business, you really need to rethink that plan and turn it into something, and just get all that together. And then also just have discipline. Have freaking UTM tags on all of your links and stuff like that. So if nothing else, your last click attribution is solid. View through's always been witchcraft anyhow. If that becomes even more machine learning driven, that's fine, but at least get that last click stuff going. Be tracking all your Gclids and Facebook click IDs and all that kind of stuff so you can upload them back as offline conversions too.
Awesome. And Greg, how about on the MetaRouter side?
I think a lot of the similar recommendations. I mean, I think what our product is a server-side data routing architecture that you run either on your own private cloud or as kind of a private cloud as a service kind of deployment. But still, like Nick mentioned, there's a lot of client-side sort of organization and rigor and sort of care that's always necessary. And historically, people have been able to just abstract that off to the third parties, to just trust that people are going to keep up with, browser compatibility and cookie compatibility and regulations. And we're increasingly see that become impossible because things change so fast and these are big trains and boats to steer. So kind of centralizing as much as you possibly can, the way that you collect data, the quality of the data that you collect, standardize that. There really is very little excuse in this day and age to be sending 20 order completed events to 20 different partners using 20 different JavaScript libraries and 20 different tracking syntaxes, because you're inevitably going to see a huge variety of the ways that ad blockers are going to impact the sort of the consistency and the ability to build audiences across those pieces because they're getting slightly different information. So definitely centralizing into sort of customer data integrators, customer data platforms really helps to sort of standardize the data that you're tracking, and then own it as much as you can. Try to avoid black boxes where third parties are making decisions about how to deliver the data on your behalf, how to make decisions. As much as you possibly can, own the data structure, own the schema, own the mappings, own the integrations, so that you can make quick pivots. Even if it takes Google 3 months to ship an update to the global site tag because of GDPR, you can do that instantaneously because you have a consent banner on your site. You know what consent preferences your users are making, and you can, on an integration by integration basis, just drop data and not deliver it because you own the architecture. And I know that that's sort of a level of data maturity that isn't practical for everybody, particularly in smaller businesses. But I think it's becoming increasingly easy with solutions like ours to manage those kinds of data routing architectures and take sort of the data engineering complexity off the table, so that really you're just pulling and adjusting levers, but they're your levers. They're inside your private cloud and they're first party, and they're less subject to compliance risk and they're less subject to security risk. And that's really how we approach it.
Awesome. Well, we got just a couple minutes before we're going to kind of kick it over to Q&A, but I did want to sort of just get last thoughts. I mean, this is obviously a whole different conversation in general, but, we've touched on it a few times, GDPR, CCPA, how, just to kind of tease it a little bit, because obviously we could go on for another 30 minutes about this topic, but, how do you guys see sort of that story kind of fitting in with this sort of larger cookie story, which is essentially, people are needing to kind of get smarter all around with how they're handling, this consumer data?
Yeah, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. Working here in the US, I think us marketers spend a lot of time being irritated by the GDPR and trying to figure out how to circumvent it or minimize it. And I went to a conference in Europe in January, and it was all data analysts and marketers. And what blew me away is their concerns with GDPR was how to be more compliant and how to better protect their customers' privacy. And it was such a different mindset. And I was the only person there who was like, I don't really care if everybody knows, what my general interests are and are serving me better ads. I don't care that Amazon has my order history. And they were really of the mind, no, that's something proprietary to you. That's something you should have control over. And the thing I'm really wondering is if our mindset is going to shift that way. Because I think if it doesn't, all of this stuff is just going to become a technological nuisance, and it's just going to be a cat and mouse game with, let's try fingerprinting. Okay, now, Brave's doing a lot to reduce entropy so that you can't fingerprint anymore. Okay, let's, decorate referral links. Well, Apple broke refers now, so we can't do that. And that's just going to keep happening. And, with something like MetaRouter, you can hide a lot of that because it's just behind the scenes and it's invisible to Apple until their machine learning algorithms get good enough that they infer that you're running MetaRouter through some magic that hasn't been invented yet. And so I think what we're seeing with California is we're beginning to see that mind shift, with California leading the way in liberalism. But I don't need to tell anybody right now that this is a very important time for a tide of liberalism or something. I don't know what it is, but there are massive mind shifts going on right now. And I feel like that's going to drive it much more than regulation. We have plenty of unenforced regulations in this country already. GDPR is really poorly enforced. It's all about people buying in and thinking that that's the right thing to do for their customers and for themselves.
Yeah, and we've seen the abuses of customer data with, all of the different times that Facebook's been in trouble and so many others. I mean, they're an easy scapegoat, but there've been so many data breaches and sort of completely inappropriate sharing and using of private customer data that's above and beyond and unnecessary for what I think smart technology should be solving, not just an overabundance of really private information. And so, I do think that the correction is necessary. I think that GDPR did a good job of correcting. The internet has been just like a toxic, completely unregulated wild west for so long. And I think it's really important that users are able to, if they want to, take control over how their private and personal data is shared. And I don't think anybody that's in the business of trying to circumnavigate that is going to be successful for very long, because not only will corporate opinion on that eventually change to reflect, the private sector and individual opinion on privacy, but I think regulation will eventually catch up and make it impossible too. Like you're saying, Apple will just continue to get smarter at understanding how and where people are sharing information. So I think what you kind of have to trust as a marketer is that if you play by the rules, if some things like GDPR maybe are slightly overcorrected, that then technology will come back and find solutions for the partners that you're integrated with and the campaigns that you want to run and the way that you want to monetize your business and the way that you want to monetize your apps and websites will continue to be possible, because as regulation and private sector control, like ad blockers, make things impossible, other pieces of technology will just make you able to solve those same problems and run those same campaigns without the pieces that are now being regulated. I don't see a world where advertising needs to continue to be impossible without knowing your email address. It should be possible soon to continue to have really effective, audience-based, highly targeted campaigns that can use and utilize anonymous solutions. And you could be not a conglomeration of your home address and your IP address and your social security number and your email address, but you can become a conglomeration of your interests. And so you'll be advertised to you based on your archetype and not based on your home address. And I think technology will catch up and get there. And DSPs and SSPs and the ad ops ecosystem is going to figure out a way to anonymously attribute users. It needs to happen, and it's going to happen, because I think the inevitable overcorrection is that the internet is no longer free. You have to pay for every site you go to. And nobody's going to actually allow it to get that far. Technology and innovations will happen and are continuing to happen that will allow better answers to these problems. So I think as a marketer, you just follow the rules. Do follow the rules. Don't try to come up with solutions that circumnavigate the rules and try your best to control as much as you can to maximize your efficacy and achieve your goals. And then to some degree, trust that the internet and the industry are going to come up with innovative solutions that still maintain AdOps efficacy in either an anonymous way or a more intelligent way. But customer privacy is important, and I don't think anyone should be in the business of trying to get around that. So.
Well, I want to kind of offer just a few minutes for anyone, if they have any kind of questions, kind of shoot them in now. Maybe we can kind of run through some of them. I think we've been kind of going through a little bit here, but maybe we can touch on that last one David sent in, where he kind of talks about Marketo versus Salesforce. Any quick thoughts on that one, Nick or Greg?
Yeah, as somebody who's played with, I think, every platform out there that's existed since about 1995, I have a love-hate relationship with all of the enterprise marketing platforms. What I would really say, if I can pimp for MetaRouter a little bit here as well, or a similar solution, is that if you've got a good data pipeline, even if you're cobbling it together to some degree with tools like Zapier or anything like that, you can get pretty much any platform to do what you want. Again, it comes down to having the discipline to be capturing those cookie values and click values, getting them into your CRM, wherever that is, and having the support or talent you need, whether that's in-house or working with someone like us over at McGaw. I mean, that's what we do. Or using a tool like MetaRouter that makes it a lot more point and click, where if you shift from Marketo to Pardot and then to MailChimp or whatever, you can just drop in the new Lego brick there and pipe your data to the destinations you want. So definitely, I take a platform agnostic approach, but you also want to build your MarTech stack platform agnostically so that you're agile enough to shift around when you need to.
All right, we got another one in here from the Q&A section. It's asking, not asking predict the future, but companies are interested in controlling the first-party data in a way compliant that will eventually be implemented as for flexible solutions like Google, Safari, Firefox. Kind of what's the best course of action? So I think this is, if I were to
it's really a similar answer, to what Nick said. The one caveat when you talk about first party is if you want, we think the best way to maintain compliance is to do everything first party first, so that you're in control all the way up until the point where you're communicating with third parties, as opposed to allowing third parties to communicate with themselves, which is essentially what a lot of tag managers really power. So it's really the same answer as Nick gave, with the addition is you need to make an investment in the first party service itself, whatever that looks like for you. So that could be, like he said, a homegrown series of Zapier hooks that you're running, although that's kind of third party. Zapier's still touching the data. So it's a little bit complicated. There are emerging tool sets that are either open source or sort of managed services like MetaRouter that allow you to set up what Nick was talking about, but exclusively in a first party context. It kind of makes it difficult and challenging if that's a priority for you, because we see this a lot in really specific industries, like the kids category on the iOS app store is becoming the craziest and most regulated space on the internet. And the only option for them, if they want to be able to do anything in the advertising or analytics space, is to try to do as much of that as possible first party. So that means running first party data pipelines, probably installing first party analytics tools. I mean, just literally making sure that your data never exists on anyone else's servers but your own. That's a really important and will probably be increasingly important goal for a lot of companies that operate in spaces like financial tech or health tech in any way, or even deal with transaction data or data with, it's private groups like kids. Getting on board with either partners or finding a way to homegrown your system to make sure it exists on your cloud within your control with appropriate security measures is really the only way to do it, because using SaaS providers for that kind of integration is going to increasingly become impossible and so highly regulated that it's difficult to be effective. So
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, your question, what to be compliant with what will eventually be implemented, really shouldn't be the goal. We don't know what's going to be implemented, and that's going to be a shifting target between technology and government. So it really is start owning your data and storing it. Even if you are still using cloud providers, get the most critical data at home. And it's fine if you have MetaRouter collecting stuff and Google collecting stuff and Marketo collecting stuff, but make sure that those crown jewels of data are in-house. Even if it just means they're a CSV file sitting out on an S3 server for a year until you hire that analyst who can do something with it. Just put a password on that CSV file. Don't be Experian.
Yep, I was thinking the same thing. My first thought was sort of, you know, from the engineering standpoint is like just building your engineering, you know, our consumer data infrastructure, right? Throwing things into a warehouse, kind of just getting it accessible and consumable, right? That's sort of the other piece of it. How can you kind of get the data to where it can easily be moved around without sort of having the proprietary spin that a lot of these places want to kind of put on their stuff. And so if you have sort of that raw consumable data, you know, kind of like Nick's kind of following up, then the power's in your hands. Then if things shift, you know, you can shift your strategy and kind of fire where the data needs to go. And you're the one owning and in control of those decisions. Well, awesome. Looks like we might have one more last question. We got just a couple minutes left. We'll see if we can kind of fire this fast.
I'll touch it on.
Yeah, Greg, go for it.
So page speed and third-party JavaScript, good question. It's particularly around client-side and website solutions. Obviously, mobile is a totally different answer, but the simple answer is don't run tags. And I know that's crazy because a lot of these services need them, but there are ways to avoid running tags. Increasingly, most of these partners have server-side APIs. But really in this day and age, the only critical thing that tags do that can't be done off the page is negotiation of identity. And if you can find a way to essentially populate that identity or get a hold of that identity or utilize match tables that you control or integrate with fingerprinting solutions or whatever, then you don't have to allow the tags to do that negotiation of identity. You can actually do it yourself. And that's one of the things that we do at MetaRouter is essentially we look at tags and we figure out what are the mechanisms that they're using to either set identity or negotiate identity to the page, and then move all that logic into the first party. And then utilize it with server-side integrations so that you're no longer ever having to drop a full Facebook library. You're only having to drop maybe just a single 1x1 pixel in order to populate the Facebook profile cookie or set an external cookie for the tracking library that you're using, and then be done with that library. And obviously the sort of the standard CDI sort of CDP value prop is that instead of making 20 calls from the page, you make one call and then, you know, triangulate that call behind the scenes to everybody else that needs it. So obviously you can cut down on a lot of network bloat that way, but cutting down on the JavaScript bloat is possible. It requires you either really taking a lot of time with your marketing team to understand the tags really well and implement sort of slimmed down customized solutions that use as little third-party JavaScript as possible, or, you know, working with people like us who spend a lot of time thinking about that and find ways to negotiate identities outside of the JavaScript library, outside of all the individual cookie syncs and network requests in order to slim that process down, persist that menu of IDs as long as possible, and then do all of the communication with the third party from the server. And it really does, I mean, with a lot of our clients, we found that for every 3 tags we remove, we get about 700 milliseconds back of overall page latency, which some of that is asynchronous. Obviously, it's not like, you know, 20 tags doesn't equal 8 full seconds, but it does have a huge impact on time to value, especially if you're in certain industries like e-commerce. I mean, it's so critical that your users don't get bored and just go to Amazon. And it really is possible to sort of separate out the identity piece from the eventing piece and slim down the identity piece and take control of that cookie space and keep it as first party as you possibly can, and then try to do all of your communication off the page. That helps you be more compliant, but it also, has a dramatic impact on page speed. So,
and I'll just add, I think that fits in a lot with the conversation with email as well, right? I mean, like if you have a hashed email address you can send along with your events, you don't need a first party cookie to essentially handle that identity. So I think that kind of circles up all the stuff of sort of bringing it in house and sort of controlling it. If you can start to control the identity and the CRM side of things, then you're not beholden to essentially having to run those tags on the client side anymore. So. Well, that's it. We're kind of just a little bit past our time. This was an awesome conversation. Thanks, Nick, Greg. Really appreciate everybody taking time, and hopefully everybody kind of enjoyed it. Dave, I don't know, as far as I know, you said you're going to be recording. If this is going to be something we'll have available, and sort of if you have a follow-up email or something, kind of letting people know where they can, kind of rewatch this or kind of pass it along. But otherwise, thanks everybody for participating, and thanks everybody for joining as well. This was great.
Yeah, take care. It was fun. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.